In this lesson, I'm going to show you some of the effects that you can achieve with the camera. So for that, I'm using the rough mobile phone body that we had previously. One of the first things that you may encounter is when you're working really close up on detail, is that when you zoom in, at some point you will experience clipping. That's seen over here. The camera is clipping away whatever's in the foreground, which is too close up. Again, depending on what size you're working on, this might become a little bit troublesome if you're really looking at very, very fine detail. So to adjust this, what I want you to do is open up the camera editor. It's located under Windows, Editors, Cameras. In there, you have access to all three orthographic views and the perspective one. If you click on the word camera, there's the three orthographic ones. In this particular case, I want to adjust the camera itself. If you scroll down under Digital Properties, you will see the near and far clipping. So if you adjust this number to a lower one, let's say 0.01, you will notice that it's not clipping away anymore here in the foreground. Another thing that you can adjust, if you switch to lens properties, is the focal length. The Alias default gives you a very nice view of your geometry. However, there might be some cases where you want either more smaller fisheye effect. If you switch this focal length number to, let's say, 8, notice that the perspective gets a little bit more forced. If you switch this to even a lower number, you will start to get a much different effect of your product. So in this case, it starts to look a little bit more distorted. In some cases, this can be good to either create the effect of something that is a very large object, for example, if you have a lower eye view, eye level, or also, if you make this even smaller, you get very much of a distorted, dramatic fisheye lens effect, if you like. Also, with this, you can adjust, if you're in the perspective view, if you look at the viewing panel, you can also use these twist and rotate functions here on the side to twist your view or to also rotate. So this can give you some very dramatic effects possibly, if that's what you need for a particular presentation or for the aesthetic or look of the rendered image. However, there may come a point where everything is going a little bit too crazy. This is where you want to use the Reset View button. It's located under View on the palette. Under Reset View, if you click on the perspective window, it's going to jump back to its default. Again, in Auto Studio, this is a very large view, so the product is very small. I'm just going to use Alt-L to quickly zoom in. I could do the same thing with the Look At feature here in the viewing panel as well. With this also, when you're rendering, you may have noticed when you create a rendering, you try to create a perfect composition, that once you've rendered, the rendered image actually may clip or trim on the edges. This can happen depending on what you choose in the globals. In the render globals, if for example under image file output you chose just the regular full screen view, which is located in this preview panel, or if you chose a particular resolution such as NTSC or different, we're going to go for let's say the full Cine version here. If you have this particular resolution that you want to render at, the view that you see in the camera may not represent that accurately because it shows you the image just on how it fits onto your computer screen. So to preview the correct resolution as to how it will render when it comes to its composition, click on where it says the word free and scroll down to your render resolution. Right now I chose 1416 by 1062. Notice that this starts to clip the perspective view a little bit. This now is the accurate composition as to what it will render at. So this will sometimes help to more accurately compose your image and get the desired result once you render it. If you want to switch this back, just go to Free and then use the F5 or F8 button for the perspective one or the other views as needed. Finally, for this part, there is also a really cool feature which is called the hidden line rendering. For this, I'm going to create some default lights. If you click on Render, Create Lights, Create Defaults, This will create a directional light, it's very large here right now, and an ambient light. You can see that in the side view. The directional light, I'm going to scale this down so you can see it a little bit better. The directional light is much like sunlight, coming just from one direction. I'm just going to create these just so that we can make a rendering. If I was just to render this out right now, this would just give me the default shader on this whole product. Let's go to Direct Renderer. I'm just going to make a raycaster with this. Notice that the resolution is very low in how I created this right now, but it gives me a first idea of what the product may look like. However, I want to create an effect, again, that's called hidden line rendering, that's located on a renderer. In the globals, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's hidden line rendering parameters. In here, you can switch the parameters globally. Scroll down a little bit further. And I'm going to use a fill color that is black and a line color. I'm going to choose for this orange tone. And I'm also going to add some patch lines. You'll see in a moment what the effect is of this. Now to see a hidden line rendering, I'm going to switch, when I go to Direct Render Options, to the very bottom one here that's called Hidden Line. If you click on Go, notice that it starts to give a line drawing representation of the surface. Now it still shows this at a somewhat low resolution. So to fix this, if you go to the Render Globals, I would go ahead and change the mesh tolerance to a much lower number. And to repeat this rendering, all I need to do is drag another box over the geometry, and it will update the rendering. So now this can be very, very useful, especially if you're working or have a work in progress presentation, or if you want to sketch over the model using just the lines as reference. Finally, for this, I want to show you how to create some depth of field for this geometry. In this, if you open the camera editor again, under Windows, Editors, Cameras, you may have noticed that there's the option to create depth of field. If you turn the depth of field on, you get a few new options in here. The f-stop, if you're familiar with photographic effects, and also something very important called the focal distance. I'm going to leave this window open and open up all 4 views because I want to make the camera visible and take a look at how far the camera is away from my geometry. For that, I want to turn the grid back on and also make the camera visible. That's under Object Toggles, Camera. Now for this, I'm going to roughly calculate the distance of the camera to my geometry. This is roughly 3 grid units if you're working with a grid spacing of 1. So for my focal distance, I'm going to type in 3. Notice that now all of a sudden the camera appears to be much smaller. This is my focal distance right now. Whatever is in this area will be in focus. So for this, I'm going to make this a slightly higher number, like 4.5. Now, whatever's in this area should ideally become focused. To test this out, I want to start with a higher f-stop number in here in the camera editor. The reason for that is that the depth of field is a post effect that may take a while to calculate, and I don't want to have too much depth of field in the beginning. The higher the number, the less depth of field I will actually get. So to test this out, depth of field is on. I'm going to switch to the perspective view and just create a rendering. Make sure you switch back to Raycaster. Click on Go. Now notice that the rendering first created a regular pass over the geometry, and then it paused a moment to calculate the depth of field. Depth of field is a post effect. For this, I want to now try and use a much lower f-stop, and you will notice that you will receive a much greater depth of field effect. I'm going to close this window and direct render this one more time. Notice that in this case, the depth of field took much longer to calculate, and also that I may have to adjust my focal distance to truly capture parts of this in focus. Again, I like to start with a higher f-stop just because of the amount of depth of field I'm receiving right now might be too much. So in this case, I make two adjustments: a higher f focal distance and a slightly higher f-stop. I'm going to render this one more time to get the effect. Now you can see that parts of the geometry is nicely in focus while the rest is somewhat blurred. Again, this is sometimes useful to create photorealistic effects. Sometimes it can be used to just hide areas that are not yet fully developed or in progress. Keep in mind though that this process does take a little bit longer to render when you're playing with this. In this next lesson, I will start to introduce you to some of the effects you can create with shaders and texturing. In this lesson, I'm going to show you a few tricks that you can achieve with shading and shaders and textures. For this, I want to create a cylinder, primitive one. I don't need any caps on it, so I'm going to turn those off. I'm going to place it in the side view using the grid snap and scale this to a size 4. This cylinder will act as the guinea pig sort of for all the textures that I'm going to create. I'm going to place it sideways, also bring out a plane underneath it. And the next step is very important on how to create a light so that I can accurately see some of the textures. For that, I'm going to start and open up the multi-lister. Because we're going to be creating quite a few shaders, I'm going to make these smaller by right-clicking in this window, choose small icons, create a new light. I want to change this to a spotlight, turn the shadows on the spotlight. In the spot parameters, I will add a little bit of drop-off, such as 4, and a little bit of penumbra. And I'm also going to scale the spotlight down. Go to scale and type in 0.1. This is just so I can better see where the spotlight is. I want to position the spotlight so that it shines at a 90-degree angle, roughly, onto this top edge of the cylinder. And you will see in a moment what I mean by that. A 90-degree angle refers to a 90-degree angle towards the camera. If I rotate this a little bit, better way to see the angle is by making the camera visible. Again, this is under display toggles, object toggles, camera. Take a look at the camera here in relation to the spotlight. That's about a 90-degree angle. Also, in this particular view, you can see how they're roughly coming from the same direction, but again, the light is over on the other side there. I'm going to turn the camera off again, go in a little bit closer, and I now want to test to see if the light is doing the correct effect. What I want to get is a highlight across this area. So for that, I'm going to direct render this scene using just Raycaster because that's faster. And now notice that the light obviously is way too dark to start with. This is because the multi-lister, when I created this, it only had a intensity of 1. So I probably want to try something around 16 and render this again. Now notice that I start to get a very nice highlight across this part of the surface. However, it's a little bit strong. In other words, it's blowing out where I will lose surface definition. So probably a good number for this to use is somewhere in the 14 intensity range. Also, I'm going to create one more spotlight that comes from underneath the surface. I'm going to take this first one, make a copy of it, make it a much lesser intensity, such as 8, and turn the shadows off. And this copy that's active right now, I want to move over, and in the side view, move it underneath my geometry and rotate it so that it's pointing upwards. It's going to use this as a secondary light source in here. So if I render this, hopefully I will catch a little bit of light underneath here. Go back to direct render. I have my highlight that starts to work better. I got a little bit of reflected light down here on the bottom. So with this now, I'm ready to start and create a wire mesh texture. For that, in the multi-lister, I'm going to create a new shader, call it wire mesh, and make sure to assign it to the geometry. Shading, assign shader. And I want to start by creating just a transparency map. For that, on the shader, under common shader parameters, next to transparency, I want to click on the map button and choose a ramp. A ramp is a quick method of creating some geometric patterns. I want to choose a ramp type of UV ramp. And on the right hand side, I want to close some of these sliders. On the left hand side, I want to move this slider a little bit higher up and create a few more like this. Whenever a slider is active, it will have this white ring around it, and I can choose to change that ramp color. I want to create 2 white ones in between and switch the interpolation to none. This means that there's no gradient between the 2 colors. If you take a look at the multi-lister here, it starts to look like a window pattern. With this, what I can do on the ramp, under surface placement, I can rotate this by 45 degrees, which will create a diamond pattern, and also repeat this a few times in U and V direction. One of the things that I can do also in here in the multi-lister is if you take a look at this small white triangle, moving that triangle up will give you a higher resolution preview of the effect of the shader. Now with this, I want to immediately go ahead and try to see what effect this change had. Also, from the previous observation, I noticed that the highlight was still somewhat strong. So this is where I reduce it a little bit more, maybe to about 11. If you switch to the perspective view, I'm going to create a direct renderer just to see the effect. Again, I'm still in ray casting. Notice 2 things that happened. One is I do get a nice effect of the transparency. However, the highlight is still going over the entire surface, treating it as if it was maybe some printed clear material. And the other thing is that in ray casting, the moment I put transparency onto the shader, I lost the shadow. The shadow you will only be able to get back when you ray trace. But first things first, let's start to get rid of the highlight area in the transparent areas. The highlight areas are caused by the specula of the shader. Now I can make the specula, for example, very bright. Take a look at the shader here. Get a very bright specula. Or I can move the slider all the way dark to where it's black. Black equals no highlight. What I want is to create a highlighted area in the opaque parts of the shader and no highlight in the transparent parts. For that, I'm going to take the ramp that I already created that's controlling the transparency, and I'm going to temporarily save it into my texture directory. Go to File, Save As. I'm just going to leave the name as is. It's your texture directory. Click on Save. And now I'm going to load this saved texture into the specula of the wire mesh shader. Click on Map, and in the window that appears here, click on the Browse button on the bottom. This opens up the texture directory, and that's the ramp that I've just saved. Click on the ramp, open it. When I render this now, you will see that it's almost right, except completely inverted. Inverted means I get a full white highlight in the transparent areas and no highlight in the opaque ones. This is because I'm using the exact same black and white pattern for both transparency and specular. To adjust this, I need to take the ramp that I just assigned onto specular, scroll down to the bottom, and under Effects, invert it. If I render this again, you will see that now you start to get the correct effect. At this stage, we can add some thickness to this by using bump. It would be possible, theoretically, to build this out of geometry and not use texturing, but it would be a very, very heavy geometry. Again, if this is for visual representation, texture mapping is the way to go. On this, under Special Effects, Bump, I'm going to click on Map, and I will choose to reload that exact same texture I just saved earlier. Click on Browse and choose Ramp once more. This alone will not work just yet because the bump will happen right on the edge between the opaque and transparent areas of the texture. If I render this now, you will basically not really see any effect. To get an effect, I need to switch the ramp type from none to something like smooth. Also, I'm going to take the black handles on the top and bottom and move them slightly inwards. Take a look at the image over here on the right. You can start to see how I'm pulling these towards the opaque areas. Black was the opaque part. And how this will start to create the effect of a bump. If I render this again, you will start to fully get the effect of the bump map. Now notice that there's still no shadow. The shadow you will be able to achieve by using Ray Tracer. If you click on Direct Render and choose Ray Tracer, you will see that yes, you will get a shadow, but there's two other problems appearing. Now notice that it appears as if the wire mesh is distorted through the transparent areas. And even though there's a shadow on the ground, notice that it's not visible through the transparent areas here. First, let's start on fixing the distortion. By default, every shader is being treated, if opening the wire mesh shader here, if you click on Ray Trace Parameters, it's treated as glass. That's the default. What you want to do is click on glass and switch to user defined. This allows you to change the refractive index. You can change this from 1.6 to 1. If you take a look over here on the wire mesh representation, there's now no more distortion on the checker pattern behind this. So this will be taking care of part 1 of the problem. Okay, here we go. Notice that changing the refractive index to 1 helped to fix the distortion that we were getting earlier. However, there's still no shadow appearing in the transparent areas. This is actually caused by the ground floor. The ground floor, I'm going to select it back here, make a new shader and assign it to the ground floor. The ground floor needs to be able to accept shadows that are being cast through reflective objects or transparent objects. So for that, I'm going to increase the number of the shadow limit for the ground plane so that it will be able to accept shadows through the transparent objects. So as you can see now, the shadow on the ground all of a sudden does become visible because the ground is able to accept them. So this is the first part of the texture demo. It does give you a little bit of information on transparency, specular, and bump. I'm going to create a new shader now and show you how to create some more realistic other materials such as wood. For this, I want to keep all these shaders. I'm going to create a new one. This one I will call wood. And for this, you will need to have a texture, either as a TIFF, JPEG, or Alias Pix file ready. I'm going to assign this shader to that surface. And before I continue with this, I want to double check that I have my picture that I want to use as a texture in my Pix directory. Over here, I loaded a few textures in. This is a wood texture that I have. It's in a JPEG format. It's just a regular texture. For file formats, one of the ways how you can change formats is, for example, this is a JPEG which will work. However, if you ever want to use just alias files, you can go ahead and F-check, click on Save Image, and save it as an alias file or alias Pix file into your Pix directory. This sometimes helps a little bit compatibility. Give this a name such as wood, save it, and this now is a alias Pix file. So I can map that onto the color, for example, of this particular shader. For that, I'm going to go to color, click on map, and whenever you want to use a picture file, one that you created or loaded yourself, click on the file button here. This will open up a placeholder, a file that's asking for an image. If you click on the browse button, this will direct you to your Pix directory. Notice in here the new alias file that I have, the alias Pix file. This is the one that I want to use. Click on open, and this loads it into the color of that shader. Now this alone is probably not yet going to really look great. The reason probably being that this texture needs to be adjusted in its rotation or scale, the way it stretches over the surface. So in this case, notice that it's going radial around that surface. I want to rotate this texture so that it goes horizontal. On the file, double click on it, under surface placement, switch to rotate this 90 degrees. And depending on what type of geometry you're using, it might be that you get slightly different rotation. Notice now that it's going in the correct direction. However, I want it to be somewhat more dense. In other words, I want it to repeat more around that direction. So for that, I need to open up the file and start to repeat it in the direction that is going horizontal. If I repeat this texture here, just using the slider to find out which one the correct direction is. This one is not the right one. You can see this probably better if I increase the resolution here. So in my particular case, I want to repeat the V direction by 2. This will likely give me a seam down the center. You can sometimes hide that seam if you choose to mirror that texture. If you look at this here now, it's mirrored over to the side, so hopefully I will not be able to see that seam. Notice now that I'm starting to get a very nice texture. Nice is defined by the scale of the pattern, so it's not no longer distorted, it's also going in the correct direction as I wanted it to, and it's starting to look somewhat okay. However, to create the effect of the wood being a little bit more accurate, I want to add a bump texture. There's many choices for bump textures. I'm going to choose that same file into the bump of this shader. So for that I have two choices. I could repeat the process of saving this texture and reloading it. However, I want to show you another trick, which is if you click on the bump map, I'm going to choose a file, and in this file what I would need to do is reload the wood texture again and do all the adjustments that I've done here. If these are not even numbers but if these are numbers with very high decimal point and so forth, that become a little bit tricky. So for that I'm going to choose my original wood texture. I'm going to hold down Shift and choose the parameters that I want to change, which is the image I'm using, the rotate, the V repeat, and the mirror. So I have 4 parameters selected, and now I'm going to click on Shift and select this file and go to Edit, Copy Parameters. This quickly loads the exact same parameters into this file, which will save me some time. However, if I render this now, you will see that I need to do some more adjustments. Notice that the bump is picking up almost every single pixel from the intensity of the original image. So for the bump map, which is this one here, what you need to do is change the intensity and blur. This becomes somewhat dependent on the exact type of file that you're using, because the higher the contrast, the more you would adjust intensity to get the same effect. For this, I will change the A mult. I'm going to try 0.2 and probably blur the image a little bit more at the same time and try out the result. Notice that this is starting to look a little bit better, however probably somewhat still too strong. So in that case, I'm going to adjust the A mult even more to a lower number and try out again the result. This effect now is starting to become more closer to what I want. At this stage I would probably start to adjust possibly the specular color. I could also map some additional texture onto the specular if I wanted to. I can also fine-tune this particular texture. If I want to, what I would do is fine-tune it by making a small adjustment and just using a small rendering area to cut down on time spent on fine-tuning this. Always make one change and quickly see the result of that change. Finally then, when the image is all completed and the texture looks the way I want it to, you can also try out the effect of ray tracing, which sometimes looks a little bit different towards that texture. Notice that this is starting to really nicely pick up the wood grain, and there's a subtle color variation between all the different elements here. And this is one of the methods on how to create realistic textures that use materials such as wood. It could also be stainless steel or others. In this next segment, I'm going to show you how to create a projected logo onto a surface. For that, there's different methods on how to do this. I'm going to start with a new shader and just project a logo onto that shader. I'm going to assign that shader, and I'm going to double click on it to go into its color and map a texture logo onto that. Now with logos, what you want to do is the same procedure that I've done earlier. Ideally, you make them into Alias pix files. So I have two textures here. It's number 38. I have one that's a color version, which is this one here. I'm going to save image. I'm going to call this 38, but I'm going to save it as a alias file. And I'm also going to repeat that process for the other one. I have another one here that's the same exact file. It's on a square canvas. It's just completely black. So this one also I will save as an alias pix file. So with these two textures, I can create a logo. I'm going to start with just the black one, just so you get to see the effect. When you're projecting logos, I'm going to start with the color here. I'm going to choose for this a projection. If I was to choose a file for this, let's browse for that 38. I'm going to use the color one for this. If I just assign it as a file, take a look at what's happening to this. It's going to stretch uncontrollably around the surface. However, projecting it will allow you to get it in a very, very precise location. So I'm going to delete this, delete active, and under color, map this in a precise location. So for that, I'm choosing solid projection, and into the source texture, I'm going to map a file which will have the 38 color version in there. Now the projection box, you need to make it visible by clicking on this icon on the button of the projection. This is the projection box. I'm going to scale it to a smaller size, like a size 1, and also rotate it into place, like this. Now I'm going to move this into the correct position, like right there, let's say. I made sure in the side view that the projection box is intersecting with the cylinder. Also, if you wonder what this arrow means, this is the indication of the upper left-hand corner of the projection box. In other words, if you compare the 38 with this box, it's right now being projected exactly as we see it, with the arrow being the upper left-hand corner. If you render this now, you will see that the 38 appears with a white background. However, there's a little bit of another problem, which is it's repeating outside of the projection box. To stop it from repeating, what you will have to do is on the projection, if you double click on it, under 3D placement, turn the wrap to off. This will now make the projection appear only within the box. That's also why I intersected it. However, notice that the outside of the projection box goes back to gray. This is because the shader is gray. So in order to match these two colors up, I would need to color match this gray to the white background. Of course, I could just click on white, that would work. But you can also use the eyedropper here and pick a particular color if this was anything else but just straight white. If I render this now, you will see that the entire cylinder will appear white with the number 38 in the correct location. This is one of the methods on how you can work if you're dealing with a single colored background such as white or similar. However, there might be times when you want to have the number 38 as a logo or decal on a shader that is a different color. In other words, let's make one that's maybe blue. I'm going to make a new shader, assign it to that surface, and make the color of that shader blue. If I now want to have a multicolored logo onto this shader, I will need to use a little bit of a different technique. There's a few ways of doing this. I found the following one the easiest to make it work for a variety of different possibilities. And it's using layered shaders. Layered shaders are the following. If I render this, if I assign the blue shader, I will get a completely blue cylinder. To layer a shader on top of another, with the cylinder selected, click on, for example, the wire mesh and go to Shading, Layer Shaders. What this just did is it put the wire mesh on top of the blue shader. If you render this now, you will see the wire mesh, and in its transparent areas, you will see the blue shader underneath appearing. One of the things that makes this a little bit complicated is if you layer a lot of shaders on top of each other, it becomes a little bit confusing to see which one is layered on top of what. So for that, you can create what's called a layered shader. This is essentially a good method of keeping track of what's layered on top of what. So for that, I go to Edit, New Layered Shader. It comes out as just black because there's nothing in there yet. And I'm going to take this shader and assign it to the geometry. If you double click on this shader, notice that all it is a little list that lets you add and remove shaders in the hierarchy. So for example, I can take the blue shader, click on Add, and now this shader starts to appear just as blue. If I was to render this now, I would get the same effect of just a blue looking cylinder. Now I'm clicking on the wire mesh and I click on Add again. This put the wire mesh on top of the blue shader. The interesting thing here is if you look at the preview of the layered shader, you will actually start to see the effect of what that shader looks like. Again, the layered shader is nothing more but just holding these two in place. So, before I go any further with this, let's create a floating colored logo. The way I'm going to do that is create just a new shader, this one here. I'm going to call this one Logo. And for this one, I want to create a series of projections. First, I'm going to start with the transparency. I'm going to click on Map, click on Projection, and for transparency, I want to use the black and white version of the number 38. This will just start to mask out the black areas to be opaque. Now also for this, I'm going to choose to turn the wrap off and make the shader completely transparent. This will ensure that wherever the projection box is, I will only get the 38 mapped out. Before I continue, I'm going to do the same thing again for the color. I'm going to click on Map, choose a projection, turn the wrap off in that one. For the source texture, choose a file that also has the 38, the color version in it, because I'm mapping this onto the color of that shader. Now you will start to see that this starts to become quite a bit of information in here. So before I continue, I'm going to take the projection boxes, both of them, both the color and the black one that's on the transparency. If I select these here, notice that there's two on top of each other. I'm going to select both, scale them, and then rotate them and move them into place. Keep in mind that they have to intersect the geometry when you turn the wrap off, like this. If I scale this now, make this a little bit larger, like this. What I should get is a transparent looking object that has a floating number 38 in color in this location. At this stage, you can take the logo that you've just created and layer it on top of another new shader. So for that, let's create a new layered shader. into this new layered shader, I'm going to drop the blue color. Could also use the wood for this. I'm going to choose the logo, put it on top of that. Make sure that that new layered shader, this one here, is assigned to the surface. So go to Shading, Assign Shader. And when we render this now, you will get a blue shader underneath and the 38 on top. However, notice that all of a sudden the highlight got very, very bright and strong. This is because both the logo shader and the blue one are blend shaders that have highlight. Now this effect can be used towards your advantage. In other words, if I don't want this highlight, I could make one of these two into, for example, a Lambert one. However, if you change, for example, the outside one, 38, into a Phong and make this very shiny and maybe give it even a brighter specular color, you can start to create the effects of shiny painted metal. What you will get is the Phong shader creating still some of the highlight area, while the Phong creates this very sharp highlight. Depending on the angle of view that you have towards your surface, I'll go ahead in here, make this a little bit brighter. You could get very strong car paint looking effects. Again, there's the highlight from the blend shader and this sort of very sharp, smaller highlight from the Phong. This becomes especially dominant or apparent once you start ray tracing. So with these techniques, you will be able to create logos in precise locations. And also you've learned a little bit about how to create some realistic looking materials with scanned-in images or photographs you've taken, as well as just learning some of the basic features that you can achieve with bump, transparency, and so forth. I would encourage you to try out some of the other features that are explained in the book. They all go along the same lines, and you can create really a variety of textures and effects once you start to experiment somewhat with these features.